So, ladies and gentlemen, do take your seats. We're going to give you another panel discussion, picking up some of the themes from our earlier one and trying to see how we can make science influence the decision-making process better. Out there, how do you take science out there, more effective, more understood? It's entitled Policy Support for Global Transition, and let me introduce our panelists to you. We're pleased to welcome Johannes Kurler. Dr. Kurler is Secretary General from the Ministry for European and International Affairs of Austria. Welcome. We have Kandike Jomkela, Director General of UNIDO, very well known here in Vienna, and Special Representative of the UN Secretary General for Sustainable Energy for All. Bill Colglazier is Science and Technology Advisor to the US Secretary of State. Sergei Iglaziev is Presidential Counselor, the administration of the President of the Russian Federation. From Australia, we have Andrew Johnson, Group Executive for the Environment for CSIRO, the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organization, and a very recent IIASA Council member. Australia's just recently joined. From the Republic of Korea, Madam Park, Eun Kyung Park, is Ambassador for Water Resources at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And we have Bjorn Sturgman, an old friend of IIASA, Chairman of Stigson and Partners, and former President of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. So we have different stakeholders here. We've been talking a lot about the need to bring different stakeholders to the table. Here they are. What do they think they need to hear from science? What kind of recommendations are useful for them in order to really address the key problems of today? And I'd like to start by putting that to Kande Jomkela, please. So, Director General of a really important UN agency, what kind of science do you think would better inform the UN process and projects?
We need all forms of science, but the question is, what do we want to use the science for? So I think currently, as we look at the UN, we're trying to define a new post-2015 agenda, defining new Millennium Development Goals, defining new Sustainable Development Goals. We need science to be able to define those goals for the world.
And has it done so sufficiently well so far?
In the past, yes. Thanks to science, we were able to define the first set of Millennium Development Goals. But as your panel was discussing earlier, now we have to define Sustainable Development Goals that take climate change and sustainability issues into consideration. We need a lot of scientific evidence to be able to define those goals, to be able to define the indicators we'll use to measure those goals. But second, and I think that's what your first panel was struggling with, how do you use science to create the necessary narratives for politicians to take action? It's a question of narratives. That's what I'm learning from business. That's what I'm learning from media. The science may be there, but how do you create the narrative that will move political action or decision making? So for example, I'll go try to use the narrative of fear and inconvenient truth. It didn't necessarily change US energy policy. Today we are debating now, do you use science to create a narrative of opportunity? The opportunities and benefits you can have with sustainable development, or for that matter, green growth. In creating either of these two narratives, you need scientific evidence.
Bill Colglazier, is it a question of the narratives needing to be beefed up? Or do you think that the scientific questions themselves need to be reframed to better influence and better help policy and decision making?
Well, narratives are certainly very powerful. I know they can be very convincing. I thought I just might address quickly, since I've sort of seen from both sides, from giving advice as well as receiving advice, and what works well and what doesn't. I think the main ingredient is actually more interaction between the policymakers and the scientists, so they understand each other's needs and culture better. I found in the work when I was at the National Academy of Sciences, which produces expert committees doing reports on all kinds of issues, trying to provide independent, objective advice to the American government and public. When it worked the best, actually, was when the scientists interacted with the policymakers to really understand in depth exactly what questions were being asked. And the same with the policymakers, understand more when scientists were talking, what was actually known, what were the uncertainties in science, when scientists were making judgments based on values that actually went beyond science.
So it's making the time to actually communicate.
Yes,
is that what you're saying?
Communication. Some scientists are extremely good at being able to communicate succinctly and simply to policymakers. Others have more of a challenge.
That's a big theme from our previous panel. Dr. Glaziev, as a presidential advisor, what would be most useful for you in terms of the scientific inputs that you get?
Well, you see, we are living now, or we're moving to the knowledge society, where the input of science and technology is about 90% of economic growth. And we couldn't live without science. Russia may be lucky because in the last century of transition, we moved from monarchy to democracy, then to democracy to communism, then back from communism to democracy. And the only institution which survived during all this period was the Russian Academy of Science. And all kinds of governments used Russian Academy of Science both for advice, for new developments. We had different experience, of course. If we deal with physics and tell them, let's do the nuclear project, they were very successful. When we're dealing with engineers, tell them, let's construct the electric power network in the country, it was very successful. But when we were dealing with the social scientists, it is a question. Unfortunately, we have to learn much more about society, and of course we have a lot of bottlenecks in our communication. But coming back to what Mr. Rubin proposed, the new contract, I think it is very important, contract between science and society. And such institution, like Russian Academy of Science, which is involved in all decision-making and preparation process for 3 centuries, I think is a very good example.
Madam Park, do we need a new contract between science and society, as Professor Rubia put it so well?
Well, in Rio Plus 20 last June, we all remember that the 2 main topics was green economy and institutional reform. I'll just give you example in water area. In energy, you have UNFCCC and you have dealing with these matters annually, but in water area, we don't have any global institutional framework. So I think this kind of very efficient institutions has been adopted in policymakers in global level. So we all aware that in the last session that in 2050 the population will be 9 billion. And people will eat more. We need more agricultural product. Maybe you are aware that agricultural product needs 70% usage of water. So how are we going to do it? 9 billion people increase that much, but we need 40% more water. It's going to be a disaster. As Mr. Lee mentioned earlier session, our society might be besieged if this trend goes on. So for societal development, for societal recognition, I'll go into probably very in detail about education, how to change the society in personal level, in individual level, but in global level too. So I'll go into that later.
Okay, thank you very much, Madam Park. Andrew Johnson, you've worked in this area for a long time, associated with CSIRO a long time. How do you think climate science can better influence decision makers and policy, an area where it has really struggled in the past?
A lot of factors at play there. I think, just building on the comments that are made by others, we often refer to this terminology of a contract between science and policymakers, and contracts to me imply a codification, a set of rights and obligations, but they also confer a view that the engagement between science and policy is a transaction. And I think that hasn't served us well. And I think the opportunity in the future is to take a deeper view here and see that interface as a relationship, and understand from life in general what being involved in a relationship means. It's about mutual respect, a give and take, a commitment for the long term, and most importantly, trust. And I think the issue of trust between the scientific community and policymakers is hugely important. If you have it, nothing else matters, and if you don't have it, nothing else matters. And I think, going to the heart of your question, certainly in my country there's been a breakdown in trust between the scientific community, the policy community, and indeed the wider community. And so moving forward, that trust has to be rebuilt. And if there's going to be a platform for moving ahead with a solution orientation rather than just cataloguing an impending catastrophe.
Important point, and thank you very much for bringing it up, and we'll explore that idea of how do you rebuild trust in the course of this discussion. Just like to go back to the idea of the contract, Bjorn Stigson, a word from the world of business, as Andrew Johnson has just said. He thinks we need to go beyond that, enduring relationships. But do you think that the world of business really has enough of a say in influencing scientific objectives in this whole area?
Well, let me say that business is primarily about implementation. Business is the main tool in society for implementing investments, taking actions. And in my view, we have a lot of the knowledge that is needed to address issues like climate change. We have technology, we've got solutions that we simply don't put to use with the speed and the scale that we could. And a key problem in this is that there is simply not the supportive policy frameworks from governments that can incentivize and stimulate business to take these actions. In the earlier panel, we heard someone say politics is the problem, not science. And we can join hands between science and business in that statement. Politics is the problem.
But do you think that scientists want to join hands with you?
Well, that is a problem. If I take climate as an example, I have since the second assessment report by the IPCC, I've been trying to get more business perspectives into the IPCC proceedings, and I cannot say that I've been very successful. A lot of the knowledge that exists in business is not being perceived as real knowledge by the scientific community because it hasn't been published in a peer-learned and peer-reviewed. And I think we need to find ways of communicating in a different way between science and business. If science and business can talk to each other in a way that we understand each other, and we join hands and we go to the politicians together and say, this is what is really needed, we will have a tremendously higher impact than what we have in the way we are acting today.
Important point. I'm going to now bring in Dr. Kurla. You're sitting at the heart of this, running this ministry. What is it that would be most useful for you in order to help make decisions with authority?
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity also to congratulate IIASA on its 40th anniversary. And Austria, as we all know, is the seed country of IIASA. And if I may go back for a moment to the foundation of IIASA 40 years ago, here we know that foreign policy considerations were in the core of the idea. This was the first moment of détente. Austria was considered as a useful supporter for the possibility of bringing scientists from both sides, East and West, together and to help in this many efforts to create peace and to foster the international relations. At the time, and this we should not forget, especially not when I have my seat next to Jan de Jumkeller, UNIDO and the agency were already in Vienna at the time, and so to say IIASA fitted in its foundation very much into this scheme. Of course, we know that things have changed, and today the challenges for IIASA and the work for IIASA is very different. But again, I think that when we focus on the work of the Vienna-based international organizations, and this is a large number, as we all know, and we are sitting here in Hofburg, which is also the seat of OSCE. So we can say that Vienna has emerged somehow as a sort of security hub. Safety and security is something that combines the work of the many organizations here in Vienna, especially energy problems nowadays play a very important role as far as safety is concerned. There is no safety in this world without access to energy. We know that the conference in Rio has brought as a result that we will have an office here in Vienna, an implementation office very soon. We know that the Director General of UNIDO has been appointed as special representative of the Secretary General in this respect. So when I come back to the work of IIASA, I think that when we face these elements, that research is, and internationally supported research is something that is absolutely needed, also from the point of view of the Vienna-based organizations, but more than that, also globally. And we are very proud that we have IIASA here in Luxembourg, in Austria, and this contributes in a way, I think, to the pillar of the Austrian foreign policy, which is hosting international organizations. This is one of the prime opportunities of the Austrian foreign policy that we really feel glad, and I can really assure IIASA that we will try as a seed country to support IIASA as good as we can. We believe IIASA has found its modern role, and we will continue to support that.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kurla. How important is it, Bill Kohl-Glazier, in giving climate science more authority, more weight, and a louder voice with policymakers, that it is seen to be international, as Dr. Kurla was just saying? Does that actually help, or does that hinder in terms of how effective those messages are in the US?
I
just wanted to ask Bill Kohl-Glazier, just to take that idea that you brought forward about the need for international work and what Vienna is doing, but it may be seen differently in other areas, in other centers. Bill?
I think in every country, policymakers often want to rely on their own scientific community, although I do think it's extremely important to have international assessments of various issues. I do know in the United States, where policy issues related to climate science are very controversial, the U.S. National Academy of Sciences has put together a number of studies which have laid out, I think, the state of science, the issues associated with mitigation, with adaptation. So I think this was heard earlier, that many of the issues are quite well understood. The challenge, of course, is there are many vested interests. There are very complex economic issues that are associated with it. And so trying to translate what is known from the science actually into policy turns out to be the biggest issue right now in the United States.
So it's not really about an international dimension. It's about translating what it means to people now and being able to address those vested interests. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, in essence, I think actually conducting the science has to be international, and that's the way it's done. For many policymakers, though, they want to look at their own scientific community to get their advice and have it translated for them, which I think why it's extremely important for every country to rely more on its own independent scientific community for advice and insights.
Sergei Glaziev, do you agree with that?
I quite agree with this, because all the major decisions are made at the national level. And which means that any government should rely, first of all, on its own scientific community. But scientific community is open, it is international. So the more opportunity we give to scientific community to collaborate with each other, including such international centers as IIASA, the better will be mutual understanding. And as for the national government, it is very important to protect scientific community from the political or ideological domination. It should be free to discuss, free to elaborate various proposals, and at the same time we need more responsibility, because not all the scientific advice is correct. We know a lot of mistakes have been done. So we need responsibility from both sides. And from the government, I think we need protection. That scientific community shouldn't be governed by bureaucracy. It should be free and open. At the same time, I think we need protection in terms of finance, For instance, in Russia, it was a law that about 2% of the federal budget should be spent on research and development, which was very important at the transition period. And at the same time, those scientific advisors which we use should also take personal responsibility on their advice. For instance, I'd like to share my personal experience here at IIASA. About more than 20 years ago, we conducted the special research program about transition from centrally planned economy to the market economy. And the problem of this research program was that it includes only economists. And the economists explain how to create a market, how to liberalize foreign trade, how to do privatization, but they couldn't forecast what will be the result of all this. We need technologists, psychologists, engineers, sociologists, and we need multidisciplinary approach from the scientific community. And I think that creation of some kind of scientific committees in the national government will be very important.
Yes, and IIASA played a real role in helping that transitional process. Thank you for reminding us of that. Madam Park?
Yes, when I listen to that, I think adoption of outcome of scientific research into policies is very much culture-bound and historic-bound. For a country like Korea, Korea is the only country in the world which has been changed from donor country to the donor country in one generation. But the backbone of that kind of process possible was, I think, government planned economic development. So government, our historic process in economic and in other areas in policy adoption process is top to down. So I can go back to the several hundreds backward about our Confucius-oriented gentry scholar thing, but I cannot go into that. But what I'm trying to emphasize is that a country like Korea can really contribute for the future narrowing gap between developing countries and developed countries. 2 days ago, Korean newspapers were covered with the success story of hosting GCF, Global Climate Fund in Korea. There's a lot of competition between European countries which has been occupied in climate area. But by having that IMF level or World Bank level fund in Korea, I think we can deliver a lot of stories from Korean experience, how we have been really reached to make how in an individual level, how we educate them, in institutional level, how we really adopt it in policy level. So country like Korea, rather than a very well-developed, maybe 100 years of industrialization, processed country in European countries, Korean case will have a lot to say to lead the way, lead the path to show to the developed countries what is really we have to do in climate solving process.
That's really interesting. So both Madam Park and Bill Colglazier have told us that your work might happen at an international level. Here, IIASA, it's hugely international and multidisciplinary. But then it needs to be embraced again at a national level and be given a kind of national identity in order to then be heard in a different way by policymakers, civil society, government decision makers back in Seoul or Washington or London or wherever you might be, New Delhi. So that's a very interesting idea that we've heard echoed there, and a challenge for you, I think, here at IIASA. I'd like to pick up on another theme to do with trust that Andrew Johnson brought forward, that one of the problems, and I think that Sergei Glaziev also said, science also makes mistakes, and this is one of the reasons why there's perhaps been a breakdown in trust. How can you make sure that the trust between the world of science and the world out there is rebuilt and strengthened? What are your thoughts, panelists? Kande Junkela.
I think that you have various models, but one of those that I have seen work in the US very well is the National Competitiveness Council. You bring the research people into a multi-stakeholder kind of community where they talk directly with business and policymakers. I think they begin to understand each other better. And the National Competitiveness Council model has been working reasonably well. As UNIDO, we're collaborating with them to set up various national competitiveness councils around the world with Deborah Wynne-Smith. Because then you bring business, research, and policymakers in the same space to talk about science, but as it relates to day-to-day issues that politicians relate to.
Do you agree
Jobs.
with the point that Bjorn Stigson made earlier, that business people find it hard to be taken seriously sometimes, that their knowledge is discounted by scientists because, of course, it hasn't been peer-reviewed and written up in research papers, etc.?
That is true. However, it's what our colleague from Korea said. It also depends on culture. In the US, the culture is built into that feedback between business or industry and science. I studied in what they call the land-grant tradition universities in the US, where for them, science was built in to provide applied solutions for community development. So that was a basis, it was a cultural basis. But the other point that our colleague from Korea made is also important in the climate discourse. The leadership of government to encourage science to provide the new solutions we need. And here again, in the case of Korea, they've made a clear move for green growth as a national policy, putting finance in it, but also bringing the laws that will facilitate that kind of collaboration between science, policy making, and business to define a new path towards industrialization. That is top-down, but it is incentivizing a lot of collaboration and R&D for a new sustainable development path. So I think in building that trust, government has a role, but when you get them together in this form that we believe is a good form within the context of competitiveness, because there is indeed a big demand today for jobs. So I come back to the issue of narratives. Politicians relate to narratives. I give you one last example. Last summer, in the World Bank, we convened a group of, again, scientists, Nobel laureates, and Nicholas Stern in a group we call the Low Emissions Development Strategy Network. The conclusion there, Nick Stern gave an example. He said when he talks to ministers about climate change or opportunities for low carbon development, they always say to him, can you give me an example where it has worked? The narrative issue makes politicians pay attention.
And makes the outside world listen.
And
because
civil
it helps
society
them to
well.
make sense of it. Because it's actually quite hard to understand highly complicated advanced systems analysis, for instance. Why that came to my mind, I don't know. Andrew Johnson.
Yeah, thanks. Maybe I can just pick up on a couple of the points about the narrative of reflecting on the Australian experience. So the Australian experience, the narrative was very much the one which focused on serious doom and gloom, and it actually scared the country and people.
And not just in Australia.
Yeah, and people, the community has tuned out, and what's happened is that not only have they tuned out around climate issues, but around all of the major contested public policy issues, whether it's around water security or food or energy. There's been a collateral damage from the experience with climate.
So do you think that by changing the focus to be more solution-oriented and more short-term, you might come up with more positive messages?
Well, my view is the scientific community has to be more option-oriented rather than necessarily solution-oriented.
More option-oriented. Okay.
Which is a great lead into my next point, which is I think when I reflect on our experience, a couple of things have happened. Firstly, scientists, as Sergei indicated, have not always proved correct in terms of their predictions or projections of the future. But secondly, many scientists, I think, have crossed the line between reporting the results of their science objectively and moved into the space of policy advocacy.
And are you saying that that's a dangerous thing?
Yes, it is. And I think as soon as scientists move into the world of policy advocacy, they join the ranks of all the other commentators.
No, but hang on a second. If scientists don't do that, how do you get your message across more successfully? Well, which is a theme that we keep coming round to. How do you get those narratives out if you don't step out of your, ivory tower cliche?
Well, as going back to my point, I think science has a role to advocate policy options rather than policy solutions, because as we know, ultimately policy decisions involve a whole range of other factors, not just science. policymakers are trading off all sorts of different perspectives, of which the science perspective is but one of a number of dimensions they have to consider. So I think very clearly for us that the scientific community is rapidly refocusing in Australia back on to providing objective science advice and science options rather than necessarily policy solutions, and working much more closely with business, with industry, and engaging our business leaders to engage more effectively in the national debate about the most contested issues that we're facing. So I think this issue that Bjorn raised is also absolutely crucial, that science has to engage much more effectively with industry leaders as a pathway to engaging with policymakers.
So things are changing in Australia, says Andrew Johnson, but have you noticed a change, Bjorn Stigson, in the way in which business leaders are engaged with and having a more a better dialogue?
Yes. I was in Rio in 1992, and that was when business first started to engage on these issues. We were a couple of hundred people. There were 35,000 NGOs in Rio. And when government stood up and talked about the world in Rio, they said the world is bipolar. It consists of governments and NGOs. So you were not mentioned as scientists, nor were we mentioned as business. 5 years later at Rio +5, then when government stood up, because we objected to this, then they described the tripolar world of governments, business, and civil society. Gradually, global business has come to engage quite a lot on policy issues because we depend on them. And I'm not sure that you have the luxury as scientists to say, we don't want to talk about policy solutions. If you really want to influence, I think you cannot sit on the sideline and say, we are not going to tell you what to do, but here are a few things that you could consider. I don't think you have that luxury. We don't have that luxury from global business today. And I was now in Rio again, now at Rio +20 in June. And when I look at the situation there, the global business community is way ahead of governments in understanding the challenges, whether it's climate change, whether it's ecosystems, and what have you. And we are way ahead of governments in taking action. But what we struggle with is to understand what was talked about, these nexus problems, these systems analysis issues that the IIASA is working with. How do we deal with the nexus between energy, food, water, land use, and a number of similar issues? These are issues where I think there is a need for quite more engagement between business and the scientific community. If I may add one more thing, because you talked about trust. Academia has, in my view, and according to surveys, a lot of trust. The people that don't have trust is business and even more governments and partly media. But you guys have got trust, much more trust than you believe. The others that have trust is civil society.
And how should they be using that then? Because you seem to be suggesting that people are underestimating the authority and the voice they have, yes?
Well, I can take the approach that some of my colleagues here have said. I can provide you with some options. But I think you have a responsibility to utilize that trust. And I think, as I said in my initial comment, that if we can find the right platforms for interaction between the community that you represent and what I represent, we can have much more impact on what are the solutions that society must consider.
Well, panel, I want to put to you a question which has only just occurred to me, which is this idea of the nexus issues and complexity and the need for systems analysis. Really, the whole point of IIASA. Its time has come, it seems to me, having listened to various interventions this morning, but it's fiendishly difficult to understand. It's really high-level maths. And one of the big issues that we keep coming over and over is communication, getting your message across, making it comprehensible to the wider audience. So how do you do that if indeed the kind of science that needs to be done now is about these nexus issues? How do you communicate the results then? Madam Park.
Well, IIASA is projecting the water scenario program that is, I think, including all the nexus, water, food, and energy, including all these holistic water-related issues to be analyzed. I think this kind of project, I hope, will give a path to policymakers to adopt. So it should be really well done, Mr. Cabot. And it should be, we all scientists and social scientists get together to bring this water scenario to be really acceptable to the policymakers. And if you give me more time, I'll just go into a little bit on other side of education. In the previous session.
Can we just come back to education? Because I'd like us to finish on that idea of education, which is a big thought from the previous panel. I won't forget, Madam Park, I promise. Dr. Kurla, and then Kande Yonkala.
Thank you very much. I come back a little bit on the question of trust. When I listen to the panelists here, of course, we have to say that politics and policy, of course, cannot analyze systems. You can also not negotiate sciences. What you need in politics, of course, is a solid basis and a qualified basis. And this basis needs reputation, on which you can base then options and on which you can base solutions. And I think, the broader and the more independent research and science institution and also analyzing systems are, the more qualified they appear, to help politics and even foreign politics. We spoke about energy, we spoke about access to energy, but let me also mention proliferation, for example. And this, I think, is one of the problems in international politics today. How can you base your own options on solid research and scientific achievements, results, and grounds? And I think in this respect, IIASA is a unique achievement and a unique organization.
Thank you. Kande Yonkala.
I think the nexus issue is the biggest challenge we have. I give you an example. When world leaders adopted the Millennium Development Goals in 2000, they didn't talk about energy. 3 years in, we started realizing that without access to energy, you can't achieve the goals. But it's taken us over 10 years to bring that to the fore. It's only 3 weeks ago I was asked to serve as special representative for energy. But we had to use IIASA science, the work that IIASA was doing, to make that case over 5 years, have the right narrative to convince the diplomats and the politicians that you must address energy, because energy issue also is political. This is why, again, I talk about narrative. We had to create a narrative with IIASA, our colleagues here, that we're talking about energy for development, not the geopolitics of oil and gas. But now we see the crucial importance, and what Michel and I are trying to do now. I was leading energy, he's leading water now, to see how we bring this together again under the leadership of IIASA. And I believe IIASA is well placed to begin to put the nexus issue on the agenda, because they had a good team, almost 500
and then
energy
how
experts.
does IIASA communicate that then, these nexus, highly complicated issues,
of all,
in a narrative that is actually understandable?
First of all, they do what they did with energy. Put together a well-inclusive representative group of scientists. In the case of energy, we had 500.
Right.
Then they convinced some of us in the UN, multilateral systems, and governments to finance a mixed group of financing institutions. So you can see that even that level is inclusive. Using that model and that group of energy scientists, I think they have an opportunity, linking some of those with those who will be analyzing water. Because we see also in some of the pathways they've developed for energy, the issue of urbanization. So again, energy security, food security, energy security, water, but also the dynamics of urbanization and access to clean water.
Something we haven't really been discussing so far is public opinion. Everyone out there, not civil society necessarily, not government, but taking the whole of society with you. How do you do that, Bill Koglasia?
Well, I think it's really institutions are extremely important to have trusted, credible scientific institutions, those that the public are willing to rely upon for non-political advice, independent, objective, not under the control of government.
So similar to what Andrew Johnson was saying then?
Yes.
Yeah.
Most of the public do not want to understand all the details of the science related to a policy issue, so they're really looking for people that they feel are going to give them expert opinions that are also objective, and so I think that's a key issue.
Are you saying it doesn't really matter if the public doesn't get it?
Well, actually, I think that it's probably not essential to that the public understands all the details of the science. I think they want to understand the big picture. I agree that narrative and stories are the best way to communicate. I think it's very important for scientific institutions to get advice from people in the media and elsewhere who know how to communicate clearly to the public. I think that's also important. But one other thing I think we shouldn't forget, what science also does, many issues are very difficult for the politicians to deal with, but science can often create new opportunities, things were not thought of, that can actually get around some of the political problems and create new options for policymakers. So, a lot of that comes out of fundamental science.
Yes, the idea that Professor Rubio said, leave room for surprises. I'd like to end by asking all of you to reflect on that idea that Kande Jumkela has thrown before us about narratives. What narrative do you think that the scientific world could hook into, make it real for me, that would capture the imaginations of politicians, business people, the wider public, civil society? Can you give me a short example of a successful narrative that takes us from science to the outside world? Sergei Glaziev.
Well, there are plenty of examples.
Go for it.
We know them very well, starting from automobiles and finishing with the genetic modification. And I think we need a system approach. It is easy to say in such audience in the Institute of Applied System Analysis. But again, it is very complex and at the same time simple, because first of all, we need much more feedbacks between a government, scientific community and business. And I should stress the extremely important role of national member organizations of IIASA. Because IIASA communicate with the countries, first of all, through national member organizations. And if these national member organizations are large enough, representative enough, including both scientists, business, bureaucrats, and mass media, then it will work. At the same time, we need to, concerning the question of trust, we need more stimulation of involvement of research and development in various political decision processes, both and in business processes as well. I think a very important thing is not to tax any kind of activity which is dealing with research and development. It should be free of any taxation. And what is the
that
most...
would be a popular move indeed, but maybe a bit difficult to pull off.
No, I should say that in some countries, $1, let's say in the United States, which is used for research and development, they get something like $0.50 for various privileges. So there are some good examples, both of funding and taxation and other stimulus. But what is the most important is education. We are moving to the society where we should have compulsory higher education. Society where almost all employees will get 15 years of education. And having such educated society, we could be sure that it will understand the theory and can communicate. We need standards of education for bureaucrats, for policymakers, and in a lot of countries, the standards are already applied.
And science has to be at the core of that, I suspect you're going to say. Madam Park, is education an important part of this narrative?
Yeah, my education concept is not that formal education-centered concept. What I'm trying to say is to get more scientists and more policymakers to be engaged in, to dealing with these global transitions, we need some education of informal organizations like museums and youth centers and scientific centers. So whole social institutes becoming the Educational Institute. That's very important. UN, very early in Rio Plus 10 in Johannesburg, designated the year between 2005 to 2014 as a decade of education for sustainable development. So this ESD is dealing with adaptability, creativity, how to deal with the problems in your daily life. We need something, this kind of solution in life. Rather, it's very good teaching our children and youth of intellectual development. That's the essential thing. But on top of that, we need something like ESD, Education for Sustainable Development. But this is where UNESCO and UN University is digging into for the last 10 years.
Okay, starting at a very young age. Andrew Johnson.
You may be going to the question of the narrative without resiling for a moment from the very, very significant challenges that humanity faces and just how hard we as a species are going to have to work to address those. I think the narrative has got to change to one of hope and a positive outlook for the future, particularly at the moment where I think globally confidence of society is low. Economic conditions are tough around the world. And we have to somehow, as leaders, and indeed my view as leaders, deal in hope, provide the community with a pathway that's based on a positive outlook for the future that, as I said, doesn't deviate from or put under the rug just how tough some of those challenges are, but we have to shift the psychology of the planet to a positive outlook and one of an opportunity outlook.
I think everyone on this panel would agree with you there, and you've put it extremely eloquently, Andrew Johnson. You've got to change your messages and find a narrative of hope and translate the very, very high-level work that you're doing here at IIASA and elsewhere into simple narratives. I'd like to say a big thank you to our panelists for engaging with this big subject. Dr. Kurla, Panda Jomkela, Bill Cole-Glazier, Sergei Glaziev, Andrew Johnson, Madam Park, and Björn Stigson. Thank you very much indeed. We hope we've given you a lot of food for thought.